And welcome to Freedom Radio. Adam Taxin, thanks for joining us, sir.
Louise, Pat. I think I pronounced that okay. That's how you say good morning in Western Armenian. It was on April 25th this year, even though the 97th anniversary of the massacre that started the Armenian Genocide in earnest was on April 24th, but just because of congressional scheduling reasons, they had it one day later. Okay, whatever.
And we're talking about the Armenian Genocide today. We're at least starting out with it so that people can learn from history and apply it to today's situation, that they have never heard of the Armenian Genocide, in that great efforts have been made to deny that it ever happened. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, and to point out, I printed an article last week on April 23rd on Examiner.com, if people want to Google it, called Jews Becoming Increasingly Aware of Armenian Genocide and its Commemoration, and if they want to also look at it, I have a couple videos on YouTube from my own show on intvwd, 8:60 a.m., but I think if you want one to start off with, it would be Armenian Genocide Discussion, Peter Balakian, Mark Garagos, Aram Pamparian, and I apologize, but Armenians tend to have long names, so if you misspell it, they are somewhat phonetic. You misspell it, but just Google Armenian Genocide Discussion and High 95 Radio Hour, and you can learn a lot about the facts there from people who know a lot more about it than I do.
That's CHAI.
95 Radio Hour, yes.
Radio Hour, yes. There have been one long, ongoing attempt to deny that the Armenian Genocide ever happened, much like people try to deny the Holocaust ever happened. And
the huge difference is that Germany does recognize the Holocaust happened in Turkey. Does not. I mean, that's a huge difference there. But, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's quite all right. There is a huge difference there. And the Turkish government has, since Ataturk took power, made an effort to appear to be secularized so that Western governments would look aside from the Armenian Genocide and let business go on in Turkey as usual. How successful have they been, Adam?
Well, somewhat successful. Remember, it becomes a lot easier to deny the genocide if you go further and further from 1915, and actually went on through 1923 to some extent. It's easier to deny if no one was alive at the time. It was kind of hard to deny, and I don't think they even really tried to deny it too hard the first couple of years, because people knew that those were Armenian villages that were now devoid of Armenians. And who knows, when we're 95 years after the Holocaust, it hasn't been that long, when no one had grandparents who were alive then anymore. It may be a different story here, but it's a lot easier the further it is. But, and remember, there's a legal aspect here, too, because if they admit the genocide occurred, there may be reparations paid. People may restore the property, and the Armenians own an awful lot of property in Turkey, so I'm sure that is a factor here, too. Remember, and, the Turkish government is not the Turkish people. I'm sure the Turkish people, probably aren't as eager to deny it as the Turkish government is. Not that anyone who's in power now had any part in it, because it, again, was 97 years old. Now, even if a young, precocious 15-year-old were involved in 1923, that person would be 104 at this point.
There are many people who are not aware of the Armenian Genocide. Let's tell folks exactly what it is.
I mean, there's discussion of what it is. I use the term jihad because I don't think it's necessarily that different from what's going on today, what's been going on for 1,400 years. I'd say between Muslims and Christians, but it's Muslims and all non-Muslims. And, you even go to a place like Thailand today, and they're killing non-Muslims there. But it's really bad in Christian areas like Iraq. Great job with the intervention there. That worked out well. Turkey, no, not so much in Turkey. There are other things, ways in which Christians are being harassed. Look at the news from Nigeria just yesterday. People slaughtered in church.
Yep.
Kenya. And the Armenians were a particularly prominent, successful minority. They were in Armenia, which is for the most part in eastern Anatolia, what is now Turkey, with some part in what is now the modern-day country Armenia, which was the very northeast part of the country. And borders shift over the couple thousand years, but they were native there when the Turks were pretty much in greater Mongolia. They were killed. War gave a good excuse to slaughter hundreds of thousands of inconvenient people. The number generally agreed upon is 1.5 million today. They were just essentially removed from what is historical Armenia. The holiest place, I guess the Armenian version of Jerusalem, is Mount Ararat, Armenians aren't allowed to even go there. It's in Turkey now. I, again, recommend people go to the YouTube clip, Armenian Genocide Discussion, and Google that in I-95, and it's a very extensive discussion with experts on it.
Often mentioned is the fact that the full-scale massacres took place in 1915, when in fact it actually started at around 1890. The impression I get of favorite targets of jihad are successful peoples, so that the jihadists can take down non-Muslims, Christians, Jews, and then rob them, kill them for their stuff. In other words,
well,
and I think often that evil people who claim to be Muslims and kill people who aren't Muslims use their love of their faith as an excuse to kill and steal.
Well, that's not that different from other situations in history. Often in the Middle Ages, when Muslims were not at all involved, well, yeah, I am drawing a parallel here. I mean, England and Germany, Jews were killed when the local rulers, the feudal rulers, their debts got too high. Suddenly it was time to kill the Jews they owed money to. That's not the only reason the Armenian Genocide occurred, but I'm sure it was a factor. I'm sure there was a lot of 1%, 99% type stuff in which resentment of people who were more successful, who may have been working harder and more educated. I mean, there's a lot of that there. I'm not an expert on these things, but it makes me very wary. It's just resentment of those who are more successful, who may well have worked harder. And they wanted to take the women too. Let's not rule that out of it. They would generally kill the men first, rape the women, and take children as slaves. That was very common.
Round up the men under some false pretense. The leaders.
Everything was a false pretense.
Right.
Yeah.
The Armenians went along with it, believing that they were good citizens. Nothing was going to happen to them.
Yeah, that may have been a little bit naive, but they were reformers within the Ottoman Empire. I think a lot of the excuse was that during World War I, war can often, as you know, be a cover for a lot, but that the Armenians would join up with the Russian Empire, which was a genuine fear of the Turks, but I can't blame the Armenians for doing that. The Russians protected them. They were fellow Christians, and the Muslims had been treating them horribly for decades at that point. So who can blame them if they were going to be pro-Russian?
They had no choice. Well,
right.
I mean, why wouldn't they?
Something of a choice. Yeah, they did have something of a choice, but the
Not
Russians
a big one.
simply weren't. The Russians weren't massacring Armenians. And,
it wasn't like the U.S. was running in to save them.
No, well, the U.S., remember, wasn't even in the war at this point. And I read something interesting recently. Apparently, Winston Churchill had very strong feelings about this.
Wasn't that cool?
He suggested, advocated using poison gas on the Turks because of the atrocities there. He said, in this situation, it would be appropriate to go a little further than we might with the rules of war because the Turks have been so atrocious in what they've been doing to their native population.
Was that Churchill or was that Teddy Roosevelt? I thought it was Churchill.
I don't know, but Teddy Roosevelt would have been well out of power at that point. I don't know what he would have said in his private life, but Churchill was on the rise and Teddy Roosevelt was on the decline. I'm not aware of anything Teddy Roosevelt said.
Teddy Roosevelt at some point in time, probably in the 1890s, spoke out in favor of doing something to help the Armenians and the horrors.
Oh, yeah. Sounds like Teddy Roosevelt. I just don't know about it.
So when who else was it? Even Wilson admitted there was an Armenian genocide.
Yeah, well, it wasn't hard to admit. It was front page news. Even the New York Times made it front page news.
I know.
Well,
and yeah, how about that? They even got that right.
Yeah, I think it was a little different back then.
Only slightly.
Yeah. They did, it was news. I don't think anyone was thinking about denying it. This was, for a lot of people, the beginning of certain human rights campaigns because this was the first real atrocity that people knew about as an atrocity. It wasn't the first time there was genocide in the world. Obviously, ask the old ancient Illyrians and lots of other peoples that don't exist anymore, even though they would have been absorbed into other countries. But genocide had occurred. I think there's something in the history of the Peloponnesian War about that. There are no Greeks left in Turkey either, for that matter. Very few, just a handful, marginal ones. But it wasn't the first genocide. Ask some of the natives of Southwest Africa who dealt with the Germans down there when in what is now Namibia was a colony. That occurred in the 20th century, I think in 1900 or 1901. But anyhow, the term genocide should be used. It's a really big deal, and it is
planned
the appropriate
extermination. plan?
Yeah, well, there's no question about extermination. I mean, it's not about the term, but it's just a certain respect you give for what has happened. And it could be an interesting issue in Pennsylvania because while Sam Rohrer was pretty outspoken about it and lost the election, obviously, to Tom Smith, Tom Smith really hasn't said anything about the issue. That doesn't mean he doesn't have feelings. But Bob Casey's been very Turkey-friendly, and the Armenian groups are not particularly happy with him about that.
I guess not. Well, what good can we say about Bob Casey, and let's not waste our time on?
What good would he be? He's not anywhere near as obnoxious as Chuck Schumer, Barbara Boxer, Barney Frank, or lots of Democrats.
Oh, he's damn near invisible. That's one of the reasons.
Oh, okay. I'm just saying, you don't want to punch him like a lot of other Democrats. He's a non-entity. Exactly.
We have the pleasure of speaking with Adam Taxin of the Philadelphia Examiner and also of Chi 95 Radio. And
Chi 95. You sound so goyish when you say it that way, Pat. Chi. You need the guttural sound.
Say it again. Say it again.
Chi 95.
Chi 95. Good
enough.
It's good as I'm going to get. I want to jump forward, though, to the application of what happened in the Armenian Genocide around the turn of the previous century, and how that is exactly jihad, and how it has the definition of jihad has not changed. In fact, as I understand it, Mein Kampf is German for jihad.
Struggle. I mean, yeah. In a sort of general way, I suppose it would be. I don't know if that's the exact term, but I mean, it's obviously two unrelated languages. They're not related unless you go back thousands of years. Yeah, that's true. I mean, it seems to be jihad. The one caveat I would add is it was a fairly secular Turkish country. I mean, it was not like the Turkish men were married to women who wore full-body burqas like a lot of the black women in West Philly today. It was not, and Turkey was a fairly secular country. I mean, the Young Turks weren't in power, I don't believe, in 1915, but they were the ones who came into power after World War I, and they were the ones who were the big deniers, and they were a fairly secular government for a Muslim country.
I think it was
they had influence.
Shortly thereafter, 1916?
Yeah, I don't remember the details.
But my point, you're coming back to my point about having been more of a secular place during the World War I, that before that, in the 90s, when the genocide actually started, that it was more of an excuse for pirating, for killing and raiding and stealing. It started that way.
Right. It's enough of an excuse, and you don't have to be that devout to want to kill your Christians. I think that's a theme, and it would be a misconception today to think that, the only people who are jihadi are the most devoutly religious, because I don't think that's entirely true.
And stay with us, folks. We'll be right back with more from Adam Taxin. And we are back. We are back with Adam Taxin, the host of Chi 95, CHAI 95 Radio Hour on WWDB in Philadelphia. You can also get it on the net. It is a fast-paced hour for anyone with half a brain, or even a whole brain. And Adam is also a columnist for the Philadelphia Examiner. Thank you, Adam, for staying with us. Adam, let's continue to discuss the status of Christians in the Middle East, both at the turn of the previous century and at the turn of this one, if we may.
Christians are basically dhimmis. Jews are dhimmis, second-class citizens in Muslim countries, regardless of how devout they are. And that's why a lot of Christians were killed. They were much more of a threat than Jews were. Jews, by and large, were not treated so badly in Turkey in the Ottoman Empire compared to in other places. But the Jews weren't a threat. I mean, they weren't in their ancestral homeland. They were happy to be there after the Spanish Inquisition for the most part. And they just weren't a threat the same way that, I guess, some of the Christian populations, and there were a lot more of them, and not living in cities. Armenians were living in Armenia. Greeks were living in historically Greek places. I guess Assyrians, who were also persecuted, Assyrian Christians, were living in historically Assyrian areas, and Jews were minorities in a few cities, and generally were not a threat to revolt.
They were particularly vulnerable to this sort of thing because they weren't in a homeland.
Well, yeah, but I don't think they were ever a threat to
no.
Turks. I mean, they were sort of a middle people between the Christians and the Muslims who were very useful.
And they certainly weren't a threat to Hitler.
Pretty big distinctions you can make between the Armenian Genocide and the Holocaust two ways. Throwing around the term genocide, Hitler would have been a lot more likely to track down a single Jew in Antarctica and have him killed because of a certain divine mission that the Nazis had, while my view is that the Turks were really primarily interested in basically eliminating Armenians from Armenia, and they wouldn't view that worked up if someone of an Armenian descent was living in Brazil, and it wouldn't bother them. And people, they often took Armenian women into their harems and married them. Basically took the women, which would not have been the case in Germany. You would have not seen that with Jews because the Jewish race had to be eliminated from the world. That's one example. I mean, the other example is Armenians were eliminated from their homeland while Jews were eliminated from the Jewish diaspora in Europe, as they were not. Nothing happened in Israel. And I always thought it was kind of curious that, they didn't send an expeditionary force to what was then Palestine to knock off some Jews, but the Jews in the Jewish homeland were okay. And another big difference is the Jewish population now is probably at least what it is before the Holocaust, while the Armenians were largely decimated.
I do think it's important, though, that we look at both the lessons of Armenia and of Nazi Germany and say when people tell us we're exaggerating about the threat of jihad, of Islamism in America, I don't think it's a stretch to say that the people in Germany and the people in Armenia were told the same thing. Oh, we're taking you to relocate you. This is to protect for your own protection.
But yeah, I think that is the lesson. I mean, the Armenian people I've known through the years, not that many. I didn't grow up with more than one Armenian acquaintance or friend.
Well, there couldn't be that many.
Well, there are in certain areas. If you grew up in Glendale, California, near LA, there are lots of Armenians in Watertown, Massachusetts. But all the ones I've met have been very pleasant. I don't pretend that every group is equally pleasant to be around. I mean, I'm not going to be that politically correct. You know that. But they've all been very pleasant. But it's not like I have some fetish for Armenians, like like Gonzo does for chickens on the Muppets. The most important thing is it's not so much. I mean, the Armenians realistically are very typical of Christians in the Middle East, including today. That's the key takeaway here, for me at least. Like, wake up! This is what's happening throughout the Middle East, including Egypt. In fact, the Armenians are very closely theologically related to the Coptic Christians. And they're going through something like this. They're not being marched in the desert yet, but they're being killed on pretext. Their homes are being destroyed. Any pretext, they're taking some of their funerals. Yeah, it's going on. It's going on in Nigeria. Obviously, it's not as closely related. It's not an apostolic church there, but it's Christians, I guess Catholics and Protestants, who are really coming under attack, especially the further north you go in the country, by Muslims. And that's the key thing. That's the parallel to the Armenian genocide. Even if the tactics are different, they want to eliminate the non-Muslim population. That's what everyone needs to wake up to.
And this is also key as to why members of our political class line up on the side of not recognizing the Armenian genocide, because they don't want to tick off members of CARE, the Muslim Brotherhood, people that might fund their campaigns, etc.
Well, and there's this really isn't a Democrat-Republican issue. In fact, I think more of the speakers last Wednesday were Democrats, that may be in part because they have bigger Armenian-American constituencies. A lot of it is about Turkey's a lot stronger, and it is a very full so-called ally, or it has been through the decades, certainly was during the Cold War. So there's a big issue there. There's so much to think about. And I just think Christians, not to be critical of all you Christians, but
you wouldn't be the first one, Adam.
Well, no, but you guys aren't as wary of these things. We sort of come through life thinking Hebrew means a people apart. We know we're persecuted. We know a lot of people hate us. I think a lot of Christians don't take that seriously the way Jews are. I use the analogy, rats and whales. In the early 19th century, whales had never had any predators whatsoever, and they just had no resistance to whalers because they never had enemies. Now, that's not true about Christians. Christians have been persecuted for centuries, but we Jews are like rats. We're always persecuted. We're always, considered like low or high or something, but somehow we always survive and thrive, and we're used to having enemies in a way that I think a lot of Christian people, sadly, are not, and probably need to wake up. And I find that some of the most outspoken people on this issue, even more than Armenians, are some of the Jewish people I've had on the show. My own show, I've had David Horowitz and Ted Bellman, who are not particularly into this issue. They come right out and say it was a jihad, and Armenians are a lot more cautious to say that. And tomorrow I'm having Andrew Bostom on my show. You probably know him.
Yeah.
And he's written a lot on this issue. I actually didn't realize he was Jewish until he told me 2 days ago. I told him I wouldn't be reachable from Friday night till Saturday nightfall. He said, "Oh, I'm Jewish too, I understand." I said, "Oh, man, there really are no non-Jews speaking out as openly as we are at that point." Sorry, I'm digressing here. But
he's been on Freedom Radio a couple times.
Yeah, no, I've never really talked to him. I just exchanged emails. I wanted to get him on the show related to this. So that's where I'm coming from on this. And it's the right thing to do. It should be recognized. It's such an insult. You know, these people grew up with their stories of their grandparents and great-grandparents. And one more difference from the Holocaust is most Jews, I mean, not to at all minimize the Holocaust, but I'm just talking about Jewish immigration to the U.S. Most Jews are not descended from Holocaust refugees or survivors. My grandparents came from Germany, not as Holocaust survivors, but they came in the mid to late 1930s when things were getting really bad over there. But for the most part, most Jews are descended from people from Poland, Russia, Eastern Europe who came between 1880 and 1925 or so. That's when the people came over on the boat. And they're not descended from Holocaust survivors. All Armenian Americans, except for some who've come recently for economic reasons out of the former Soviet Union part of Armenia, they're all descended. They all have these stories in their family, every one of them that I know. So it's just an interesting distinction to keep in mind, and I know I'm digressing, but we're basically trying to inform the audience here.
I think it's a great way to end a discussion that Christians especially need to wake up, smell the coffee, as they say, and realize that the anti-Christian language that seems so insulting to us, because it is,
right,
from this administration and from people in government today, is only the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, I mean, my message is, Christians, let me as a Jew give you a little kick in the butt, but your people are being wiped out in various places in other parts of the world, and it might be time to stand up for them.
I think so, and the good news is, though, that Christians remember or have learned have been pretty good at that in general over the rest of the population, so there's a good place to start.
Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of the religious Christian groups are pretty good with that, but I would personally like to see Christians becoming a lot more aware of some of the persecution of Christians who may not be the same denominations, but that wasn't the case in the...
Mr. Obama and his attempts to hijack the Catholic Church have been a blessing, because this has woken people up like crazy, at least the people that are paying attention, that maybe were politically active before, but never thought we'd see the day when anyone would be that stupid to take on the Catholic Church. I mean, how arrogant do you have to be? Thank you so much, Adam Taxin of, I'll try to see if I can get it right, High Radio? High
95, but you got the important part right.
Okay.
Thank you for having me on.
Stick with us, folks. We'll be right back with Mr. Ken Timmerman, Republican candidate for the House of Representatives from the great state of Maryland.